And I would like to invite on stage Andrew McAnsh. Please, Andrew, come and please warm applause from everybody. Andrew has joined our school in August. He's from Canada, originary, with very interesting ancestors, and you about it. But he also brought a very special energy to this group and a very, very strong sense of community. Is one of those guys that we really like to have around so much. For his presentation, he's been advised by Maestro Bruno Raberg, and we also would like to have a big, nice welcome applause to Anthony Sibilia, which is part of this panel. Anthony. For those of you who don't know, Anthony Sibilia is also part of our Global Jazz faculty as well as the liberal arts, and is a visionary person with a lot of wonderful ideas. The presentation that we're gonna finish today is called Music for the Great Lakes, a songbook for the Canadian Indigenous. Please clap for Andrew McAnsh.
Thank you so much, Marco, for that wonderful introduction. Let me just first start off by saying that if I didn't come to this institute, I would have never come up with a project like this. I would have never come up with a vision like this and a purpose to myself. And it was largely because of Marco, Danilo, Terry Lynn, Anthony, Bruno, everyone here at the Institute that was able, even in the first few weeks of September, to take the mirror and just turn it around so I could see my own reflection. And so for that, I can't thank you enough. So thank you so much. This is Music of the Great Lakes, a songbook for the Canadian Indigenous people, or otherwise known as the Native American people in Canada. So, for those of you who are familiar, these are the Great Lakes here. Myself, I'm from the region, in a town called Cambridge, Ontario, which the nearest city is Toronto, which you may have heard of. Interestingly enough, my father was actually born on an island just up there called Manitoulin Island, which is the home to Canada's largest unceded Indian reserve. And so it's interesting to note that these lakes are the largest fresh bodies of water in North America. And so the population density is extreme. I mean, most of Canada lives here in southern Ontario. And so even prior to Canadian settlement, the Native American people also settled around here for the benefits of the nature of the climate, the fresh water, and all the animal livestock that it supported the culture. So without further ado, my purpose here is to raise awareness for the injustices forced upon the Canadian Indigenous peoples historically and presently, and what some next steps may be to reconcile our cultures and their cultures, and make it one unified culture. And the way I went about this is to compose a 5-part suite entitled Music of the Great Lakes. 5 lakes, 1 suite, 1 movement for each lake. And the material that I'm using is derived from Indigenous tribal melodies, also my own melodies that were inspired by these tribal melodies. Bird calls, native region, I actually came up with a pretty happening bass line off of one of these bird calls that we'll get to later. And of course, my musical influence here at the Berkeley Global Jazz Institute. Now, this wouldn't be a presentation on the Native Americans if I didn't mention the nature of tribalism. Now, for those of you who are unaware, this is a Canadian residential school, boarding school. This was an initiative put forward by the Confederates of early Canada. When we got our Confederation in 1867, we thought that it would be appropriate to include the Native Americans into our society, to integrate them and teach them our language, and how we dress. But unfortunately, the way that this was done is that we would be taking the children from their families, shipping them over hundreds of miles at some times to these boarding schools, and they would be away from their families. And often would be suffering from various psychological trauma. Here's an example of a young boy, Thomas Moore, before and after his stay. I think it's just a year in a residential school system. So you can see already how the image has been shifted. And so, due to the sensitive nature of this topic, how I went about this as an artist is I decided to do a large ensemble. Now, with this large ensemble, there's so many possibilities with orchestration. I was able to recontextualize indigenous folkloric melodies. And so this next batch of music is going to be featuring these musicians. I think it's important to talk about the process as a composer. This is one of probably dozens of sketches I did for this particular suite. I apologize for the penmanship, it's not that legible, but I can understand it. And so what I would do is I would take different shapes in my right hand, for example, on a piano, and I would maybe recontextualize them with different roots. And then immediately I would write down, okay, what does that make me feel like? So we have melancholic, optimistic, dark, super uncomfortable, a little bit uncomfortable. And then after that, I would write, how can I articulate this for the musicians to understand in terms of chord qualities, in terms of scales to use over free improvisation sections. So this is part of my process. This melody here is a melody derived from a recording that was made from a Native American powwow, which is a song and dance ceremony in High Park in Toronto, Ontario. And this is the melody that was captured. And so we notice that it's voices and drums and the birds, they have to be a part of the music. So up next I have my reorchestration, my recolorization of this melody, including elements of that process that I described, which I spent a lot of time doing. I'd say it's probably 80 or 90% of my compositional process is those sketches and pacing around the apartment. And so this is my recolorization, and it features Laith Siddiq on violin. for some of the melodies that I couldn't find certain tribal melodies, because a lot of this music in this tradition wasn't written down. It was passed down orally, sound before symbol, as we learned in the Institute. And so a challenge that I had was to write a melody in such a way that resembled a melody that I was trying to capture, but wasn't an official tribal melody. So this is my recontextualization of a melody that I wrote in the spirit of a tribe that might be around the Lake Ontario, maybe the Odawa tribe or the Ojibwe tribe, which we'll talk more about in a minute. And it features this large ensemble. Next, I wrote, this is a very large part of the suite. The suite is probably 15 minutes long. I obviously can't include all of that, but for now, I can include a melody that I had written. So it's the top voice of this of these piano chords here. I got so into the West African abakwa this year and all of its permutations that I was inspired to write this bass line. And the band made this melody groove in such a way that I had never imagined before. So this is an excerpt from the theme for Lake Superior. So we had 2 days of recording, and if writing a 15-minute suite with a large ensemble wasn't enough, I had to do another totally different project for my second day. This is mainly because I was so incredibly inspired by the creative avant-garde class that I took with Anthony Shibilia here. It was really a treat, and I'm really glad that it was only just the three of us in the class. I guess the four of us in total. So in this class, which was at the end of a Thursday, and we were all so tired, but it was such a heavy class, man. It was so unbelievable. It was myself, Jonathan Suazo, and Leslie Mock. And we would go to the Museum of Fine Arts. We would analyze paintings, provide music for the story of the painting and the aesthetics of the painting. And so it made me look at music in a completely different way, at art in a completely different way, and at life just the same. So we decided to add, to include Chase Morin on piano in this next segment. And we explored the art of Canadian Indigenous artist, Norval Morrisseau. Unfortunately, Morrisseau isn't he's no longer with us, but he did great things for the Native American community in Canada. He was the first Native American artist to be indicted into the Order of Canada, which is the highest honor that you can achieve in Canada. He was often referred to as the Picasso of the North, and his paintings were deeply spiritual and sometimes political, but overall they were deeply appreciative, because he was a survivor of the residential school system, and he was able to find himself a community of Native Americans and Confederate Canadians that lifted him up to be something that he could have never been if the tables were turned. So this is Androgyny. This is one of his most famous works, and it's hanging in the National Art Gallery in Ottawa, Ontario. Ottawa, by the way, is derived from the tribal name Odawa. So, and there's a lot of cities in this country and in Canada like that. Androgyny illustrates the interconnectivity of everything and the interdependency of all things. How, for example, a serpent is able to rise from the underworld and go into the heaven world and take a completely new shape. Something to note here is the 5 main childlike figures. According to Morrisseau, these are to represent the 5 genders in Native American ideology. So that's male, female, two-spirited male, two-spirited female, and then finally physically trans. The interesting thing to note about the two-spirited and males and females is that it doesn't necessarily imply homo or bisexuality, as to instead, those who are two-spirited actually had the capacity and to see life in all situations from both sides of a coin, the masculine side and the feminine side. And so they were looked upon highly, like high royalty, and were often high chiefs in the tribe. So this is our rendition, our musical rendition of Androgyny. So next, we decided to look at a very interesting painting of Morisot's. This one is entitled Family. And in the same way as Androgyny, how we have the interconnectivity and interdependency of all elements in the life that we know, in exactly the same way, we have the same elements here in a family. To take away a child from a family is to reduce the role of a mother to what she had before she had that child. So here, we really chose to focus on the eyes and the brightness of those eyes and the sense of urgency that we can feel in this painting. So this is our musical rendition of Family. For my last musical selection, I want to play a very interesting and very charged painting here of Morisot's. This was right at the peak of his artistic, for lack of a better word, development. It's a politically charged painting, and it illustrates when a settler or a missionary met a Native American shaman and his family, his child, and according to Morisot, it discusses the unintended consequences of colonialism. So it just goes to show that perfectly good people, in the name of good ideals, are still capable of horrible things. So this is the gift. So, in my native country, in Canada, we are already making leaps and bounds. The ball is rolling in the right direction for truth and reconciliation with our native peoples. Here is our Prime Minister here, Justin Trudeau, as you may know from the news. He's actively putting in place policies to bring awareness and attention and funding toward all of the discrepancies in the Native American lifestyle on reserves or off reserves. A part of this is after school, creating anything that's better than 60 to 70% unemployment on the reserves, which is the average unemployment rate. And so when you have too much time to do something, often these natives they find themselves getting into a lot of different areas of trouble that they don't want to be in. And so these after-school programs and funding for their future is what this country is invested in. And just before I close, this was an interview. This is one of the interviews actually I did. A very enlightened, very beautiful individual. Also went to the residential schools in his youth. His name is Robbie Shawana. He's a Native American council chief on the Wikwemekong Unceded Indian Reserve on Manitoulin Island. And one of the quotes that he left me with was that we are spiritual beings on a physical journey and not physical beings on a spiritual journey. So with that, I'd like to conclude and thank you for your time. And thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to speak to you.
Great job. Comments? Questions? All right.
So, Andrew, fascinating, clear. You have such an ability to engage in the way you present the topic. Very, very, very involving, very mysterious. Your playing has grown so much. You're playing beautiful. The music, the composition, it's all in place. So I was thinking about, it's really, really an inspiring project. Truly inspiring project. And I'm always thinking ahead of myself, you know. But I was seeing like a truth and reconciliation festival produced by you. But check it out. As you're presenting this, I did a project in Panama with the Native Indians. And it would be really interesting to try to involve the whole Native Indian and do a documentary and trace it back. And in the way you're approaching it, you know how to do this already. So I'm on board if you want to do that. That's an amazing project. Okay, so congratulations. I'm so proud of you playing. Your trumpet, forget it. And the musicians, the project is really well conceived, very strong musically. Congratulations, very proud of you.
Thank you so much, Maestro.
Thank you, Andrew. That was I want to just sort of follow what Danilo said. Very clear, lovely presentation, really. The way you articulate ideas. You have, I don't know, just there's a kind of a light, but you give enough emphasis to these issues that you're starting to look at. I thought of a couple things as you were presenting that I thought in the context of something like a festival. The question always is, when anything is even remotely political, to what extent and how do you articulate that in the music itself, using words, what's the relationship between the two, and so on, right? So one thing I saw in your presentation that might, in my feeling of it, and maybe I'm skewed because we work together on the material, but when you were talking at first about the kids being pulled out of their families and into the schools, in your presentation there was kind of a quick jump into the Great Lakes and your process. But what I sensed is when you talked about Mauricio, he's your step, your bridge, you see? You can say, well, here's a particular person who was in that school system. And if you start with that, you root it in the visual material, and it gives you a kind of, without having to be hardcore in your delivery of the content, you can just talk through those paintings, and you're exposing the issues, you see? And I just wanted to say something else, that the whole notion of colonialism from a kind of large, I don't know what you want to say, societal, philosophical standpoint, is about the idea of dualism, essentially. In the Western tradition, it might be called dualism, right? There's me, and then there's other people. And what I do is I make a wall, I draw a line between myself and other people. And what that does, that makes me feel good temporarily, because I create for myself an identity. You see, identity is so much of what you're talking about. But in those paintings, what you're talking about is breaking the vertical with the big, you see, the mural. Or when they're going back and forth, it's about breaking that boundary. So I don't know, there's just something in that whole literature of colonialism that I think, depending on what audience you're talking to. So I'm saying if you're talking to an audience who is maybe, let's say you were going to give a conference, and it was a more, say, an academic type setting, you might be able to, in some of the sort of discussion, the post-colonial literature, people like Edward Said and others who started to really develop that. But so much of it is just based on what you're dealing with in that work. So I just wanted to kind of say that. I know I'm kind of saying a lot, but I think it has something to do with the way it moves. And I think that would allow you then to introduce the Great Lakes material in a more organic way coming out of the Morisot. It's just a thought.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yes, Anthony. I have to give a little bit background about this because I feel a little guilty. Because we had, we practiced this presentation in the class. We have a class that we practice for this day. And Andrew brought this presentation, and the old colonialism topic came out and created a lot of controversy because there was a strict association with Christianity. And as you see in the painting, there's actually the gift of Christianity. And I feel like by talking about it and trying to be sensitive to the issue, which particularly was an issue for me, the way it was presented, I think maybe it went a little bit further into maybe not presenting the issue as he felt it. And I think what I felt, and that's why I feel guilty, because when he presented it, there's a strong connection between the way he wrote and the way he feels that I didn't feel today, but I want to give credit to that because I think that's a very strong point of the music. And also you talk about your own parents being sort of both, Western and Indian. So there's a lot of personal issues that maybe didn't come up today because of this presentation creates so much controversy in the forum. But it's very much part of the music. So I want to just say that, Andrew. This
Thanks,
is
Marco.
wonderful. All right.
Yeah, I think while they've covered it, I just want to say I'm proud of you and all that you've accomplished over the year. From the first time, I met you and heard you play, and how you've just really flourished and grown over the year, just musically, personally. And you've, taught us many things, and I think controversy is great. Just stir it up. Yeah. Stir it up. Because that's what, how we all grow. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. It was amazing working with you this semester as an advisee and in the composition course, and seeing you put all these things together into this project and presentation. I remember many times you get really into describing something to me and that you're going to do in the presentation, and just that topic took half an hour. So you got to condense this to fit in to 20 minutes. And I think what Marco was touched on was the residential schools, and there was this very personal and very emotional for you. That's like a driving fire behind your project. Do you have that picture of you and your father that you
Yeah, sure.
So I missed that from the presentation because that was part of the presentation at one point. Oh yeah. Okay. That's okay. That's okay. Anyway, so sorry about that, but yeah, congratulations, and you know, I think this is a project can be showed in many different situations that will help us get our stuff together, despite the forces that are trying to not let us. Okay.